Shadow Man. This is definitely a game from the late 90s. Came out on the PC, the PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64 in August of 1999. And a little bit later that year on the Dreamcast. This game is developed by Acclaim Studios. I typically don't think of Acclaim as developing good new IP games. I think of them as kind of usually like it's a port of an arcade game, or they're just like the publisher. But this is a game that, yeah, would have just came out. It would have been a new IP. And I certainly remember seeing this when it came out. But I don't know. Never really caught my eye. This is a game that really could have only existed back then. It has huge, sprawling levels. It's really easy to get lost in these levels. Someone said the levels are very similar to the design of the levels in the Dark Souls games. But I mean, in these modern games, you have a map. You just expect you have a map. In this game, you have no map. You don't even have like a compass. I kind of think of this game, kind of reminds me of like a third-person BioShock. The maps in BioShock are pretty big and sprawling, but you have like a compass that's pointing you in the direction of like your next objective at least. Whereas in this, you've got nothing. It's these huge maps. A lot of stuff looks similar. It's really easy to get lost. You've been to an area before, like you remember seeing this area before, and yet you just can't figure out how to get back there. This is definitely a game that you would have wanted a strategy guide for back in the day. That said, though, it's a really good game. Like I said, it kind of reminds me of BioShock. What I mean by that is you have like two primary weapons. You have usually like a gun in one hand, and then you have like a magic spell type of a weapon in the other hand, and you can assign that to you can assign which weapon you want in your right hand or your left hand, and then you use the L and R triggers to shoot the corresponding weapon. So you can, take a couple shots with a pistol, boom, hit them with some, magic fire, throw fireballs at them. So that kind of reminds me of BioShock. Shadow Man is earlier. Shadow Man is older, obviously, than BioShock. So I should say BioShock reminds me of Shadow Man in that regard, anyways. It's got some platforming, and as you would expect from a late 90s game, 3D, third-person action game with some platforming. The platforming is a little janky, but it's actually not too bad, at least here in the remake. And that's the thing, is I've never played the original. I am only playing the remake. This remake's been developed by Night Dive Studios, and these guys have a pretty good track record for doing these kind of remakes. And this has definitely been done right. It's running on a whole new engine. It's like their own... Yeah, it's your typical stuff like higher resolution textures, but they also redid the lighting completely. So you've got a lot of real-time lighting, things that cast shadows. And the shadows basically are a lot better than they would have been on the original. You got some extra things you can turn on, like motion blur, but it's all optional. You've even got some anti-aliasing options you can turn on. There's a lot of options, actually, as far as the graphics go. You can turn on and off the high-resolution textures. You can turn off the anti-aliasing. You can turn off the motion blur. On the Switch, it's not like a consistent 60 frames per second, but it's trying to run at 60, and if you have like motion blur and anti-aliasing turned off, you'll get pretty close to 60 frames per second most of the time. I got to imagine that's running a lot better than the original, especially on the PlayStation. This is one of those games that was like a late PlayStation game, early Dreamcast game. So you have like that. It's probably pushing the PlayStation too hard. It's lucky if it's running at 30 frames per second. Or you played it on the Dreamcast with probably the PC. Would have been the best way to play this game back then. it's now available, this remastered version, on the PlayStation, Xbox, PC, and Switch. So that's cool. And yeah, it's a pretty good game. Again, you're gonna get lost, and sometimes you don't know what you're supposed to do next. Again, back in the day, this is definitely one of those kind of games you would want to, you'd buy the strategy guide with just to get the maps. But yeah, it's a pretty good game. I'm enjoying it so far. So that's Shadow Man on the Nintendo Switch.